Good morning, I hope you're well. It's time for another kids talk, but before we start, I thought I'd start with some artwork that somebody sent me. So last week we were looking at the talents and the gifts that God has given us. And so Lukey has sent me this fantastic picture showing here all the different talents that he thinks God has given him, the special abilities. There's things like music and family, games and animals. It's really cool. Thank you, Lukey. It's beautiful. At the end of today's talk, the Jones girls have recorded the verse to learn again, so we'll show that at the end. But otherwise, let's begin this week's parable. What is your favourite hobby? I'm going to let you into a little secret. My favourite hobby is something you wouldn't necessarily expect a 37-year-old man to admit to. Because my favourite hobby is Lego. Well, not just Lego, in fact. I like building things, whether it's Lego or flat pack furniture or any kind of model. I like it when I finish something and I can stand back and look at it and say, I made that. Today's parable is about two men who go out to build something for themselves. So Jesus is coming to the end of what's known as his Sermon on the Mount, and he tells all those people listening to him a tale about two men called the wise and the foolish builder. This is about two men who set out to build new houses for themselves. They search all around and they find what they think is the perfect spot. It's flat, there's water, this is where they want to build. Now, the parable itself is quite short and there isn't a lot of detail, but there doesn't have to be, because remember, the parables are just stories that Jesus is telling us. They're not real, they didn't actually happen. It's the picture language that Jesus is giving us examples that we can create the pictures in our head. So, because we know there's sand, maybe it was the beach, but it might have been the edge of the desert. That's not what's important. What's important here is that when the two men start to build their houses, we find that they actually both have very different approaches. The first man, he's called foolish. He looks at the ground and he thinks, it's flat, it looks good enough. And he starts to build his house. Now again, this is a very short parable, so we don't really know what type of house he built, how big it was, or even really what he used. But that's not the important part of the story, so I'm going to assume he used bricks. What we do know is that the foolish man built his house straight onto the sand. Now the other man, he's called wise. He looks at the ground and says, sand isn't going to be the best place for me to build my house. So he goes off and he finds some rocky ground on which to build. He starts building upwards and gets another nice house, but it's built on a nice flat, strong base made of rock. Once both men have finished, a storm is coming, so they take refuge in their lovely new homes. The winds blow and the rains batter their homes. What do you think's going to happen next? As the rain falls on the house built on the rock, it stands firm and resolute. But when it falls on the other house, something starts to happen. The rain bounces off the house okay, but as it hits the ground, as it hits the sand starts to shift until eventually the house collapses. So there we have our two builders. One whose house is still standing, and one whose house is gone. But what is the big idea here? What is it that Jesus is trying to teach us through this parable? Well, what do you think the most important part of this story so far is? Is it the builders themselves? Is it the rain and the wind? Is it the bricks? This isn't the Three Little Pigs. What's important here is none of that stuff. What's important is what they built the houses on, the foundations. what are foundations? Well, when you look at a building, you may not actually realise it, but it's not just what you can see. The building actually goes deep underground. It's not rooms, it's the base, the platform, the foundations that it stands on. They go deep into the ground so that what you can see is strong and secure. A bit like a tree with its roots. The roots, as the tree grows, go further and further into the ground and spread themselves so that the bit of the tree you can see can stand tall and strong and proud, even in strong winds. The foundations are one of the most important parts of a building, even though you can't actually see them. Like the parable of the sower from a few weeks ago, this is another parable about how we respond to Jesus' teachings. The houses they build are actually a picture of how the two men lived their lives. The first man, he's foolish because he just rushes into building his life. Yeah, it looks great. In modern terms, he'd have the big TV and the fancy fridge freezer and the nice clothes, probably got a lovely car on the driveway. But when the storms of life come, when he's battered by the wind and the rain, he finds that all the things he's put his trust in, they're ultimately weak. They've got no real substance to rely on, and everything just falls down. But the wise man, he built his house to last with a strong foundation. But what does that mean for us? Well, let's have a look at the whole parable. Everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall, because it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell and the floods came and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Matthew 7, verses 24 to 27. So Jesus is saying that the wise man is the one who has heard what Jesus is teaching and has tried to obey. The foolish man, he's heard it all and he's just ignored it. Like the song says, the wise man has built his life on the Lord Jesus Christ. But how do we do that? How do we build a strong foundation for our own lives? Well, simply by reading the Bible, by learning about God, by listening to what it is he wants to teach us from his word, and by talking to him through prayer and song. The more we do these things, the stronger the foundation we build for our own lives. Because the wise man in the story listened to Jesus, he hasn't just built himself a good foundation or a strong foundation. He has built himself the strongest foundation possible, because it's Jesus himself. It's like picturing the man. He's standing in a storm. The floods are raging around him. The waters are crashing. But he's not worried. He's safe because he is standing on God's shoulders. God, the immovable, irreplaceable, unchangeable God. The wise man is safe on his shoulders. This week's verse to learn helps to give us a picture of that. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge. Psalm 18, verse 2. So you see, it's a verse that does paint that picture for us as God being a strong and reliable foundation for our lives. It says that he's a rock. He's immovable, unchanging, unbreakable. He's able to withstand anything the storms of life will throw at him. He's our fortress. He's someone that we can run to when we feel scared or worried, and we can hide within him. He'll keep us safe. And he's our deliverer. When times are hard, he will lead us through them, and he will take us out of the dark times because he cares for us and he loves us. Doesn't that sound like somebody upon whom you should want to build your life?
Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others. Over Peter 4:10.